Give us a closer look at your bio, your background, how you got to where you are today.
Well, to get to the point of awareness, I think I've come to that so many Americans are going through in terms of waking up to the reality of what's going on in this country has been quite a process for me. And I think that transformation that a lot of people have towards the philosophy of liberty, and when they wake up to the significance of the Constitution, all the ways that our people in this country are suffering because our government doesn't follow the basic principles behind that document. You can't go back to sleep when that happens, but we kind of mythologize that into being like there are moments of awakening. But for me, it was definitely a gradual process, and I think it is for most people. I think we see that for America going through this revolution of thinking that we're going through right now, a revolution against the divine right of government. And for me, I was always intellectually inclined to a smaller government perspective, and it's kind of easy to see that the world just kind of works better when people are free, when they're able to own property and freely trade it, and they're not killing each other in large numbers, and they have the right to decide what they put in their own bodies and manage their health for themselves. It's easy to get to that point intellectually, but it was when I was in Iraq that I came to a kind of visceral realization that these issues that we talk about in the political context really are matters of life and death. They're not academic, and every time we talk about government, we need to understand that it is what George Washington called it. It is not reason or eloquence, but force, and like fire, a dangerous servant and a fearful master, and recognize that everything that government does is by force, or backed up by force, or violence, or the threat of violence. And we need to be considering what is a morally justified use of that force when we consider what is an appropriate role of government. And so for me, coming back from Iraq, dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, going through that process and really examining my core values and what I believed in, that really drove me through this process of coming to a point of awareness that I think I'm at today, where I can't let this go. And like I said, when you wake up to this, you can't go back to sleep. So for me, that's where I'm at now. I don't know how much detail you want to get into for the timeline there and how that happened, but
no, I would like to hear a little bit more about some of the trigger points, the flash points for you as a person where that transformation in your consciousness began. Maybe some experiences you've had. I mean, definitely there are a lot of people that have served that are definitely looking at the world a whole different way.
Yeah, well, I really, that was kind of the point, though, is that there aren't flashpoints. You have experiences that contribute psychologically to being able to go through this process and lessons that you can learn. But, to believe in liberty is really a matter of faith. I mean, you have to believe in the goodness of humanity. You have to believe that people acting without force, violence, or coercion being used against them, people acting with the full right of self-ownership will always lead to a more peaceful, freer, and prosperous society. That's a matter of faith. That's not a movement of the mind or a movement of memory or experience. That's a movement of the soul. And, you can't... I can point to a couple of flashpoints relatively recently in the process for me in terms of developing the understanding and a greater awareness. But the real embracing of liberty to that level of faith is definitely, at least for me, it was a very gradual process. But in terms of the economic realities and seeing how the manipulations of a central government or a centralized planning authority affect freedom and prosperity in society, wrapping my head around the idea of the Federal Reserve was a bit of a process. I had to watch several documentaries and do some research on my own, and before my brain just kind of closed around the idea, and I was able to get it. And then there was I've had one other thing, because I've done a lot of self-education in the field of economics and from the Austrian perspective, and I would gather bits and pieces in a sense, like economic concepts. But then it was during the bailouts. Actually, this is one instance where there was kind of a moment of awakening. I was watching the bailouts in late 2008, right before the election, going, oh my gosh, what is going on here? And I was watching TV one night, watching the news with some friends, some fellow veterans at a group home for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans that I started in D.C. and I turned to the guy next to me, and I just went on this rant about how the bailouts, were basically just part of the same government scam to steal from the poor to give to the rich. And I stopped at the end of it and was like, whoa, where did that come from? But for that, my understanding of really the free market and the ideals of that did kind of crystallize in a moment for me.
Well, let me ask you another question. How aware do you think some of the people that served alongside you when you were serving in the war are waking up to some of these things? Is there a certain percentage that you can estimate?
Well, I don't want to. I never try to speak on behalf of the military, but there are several things I'd like to point out. When talking about the attitude or the perspective of the military, and one of them is that there was a Zogby poll that was done in February of 2006. So this is going way back. But even in February 2006, 29% of the troops thought we should be out, so we should leave Iraq immediately. This is boots on the ground in Iraq. And 72% said we should be out in a year or less. Well, hey, here we are, almost 4 years later after that survey was taken, so I can only imagine those numbers are going up. But the other big thing, of course, is that the presidential candidate in 2008 that received more campaign contributions from active duty service members than all other presidential primary candidates put together was Ron Paul.
Mm-hmm.
But the choice of the active duty service members that were paying attention to politics enough to be engaged and following and donating to candidates, they were supporting the guy who was a non-interventionist, a champion of the Constitution, and advocating for an end to these open-ended conflicts, this liberal nation-building we're engaged in now in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Tell us about the story where you were arrested or almost arrested. I'm looking at a picture on the screen here of a protest that you were engaged in, and then a woman putting some sort of plastic handcuffs on you.
Well, there was we did a memorial ceremony in the Senate Hart office building in order to bring attention to the cost of the war and raise some veterans issues. And I was there with Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who was saying a prayer for all. He's also a former Air Force chaplain, and he was saying a prayer for all of the in memory of all the troops that have died during the global war on terror. And because there were so many people around us cheering, they called it a unlawful assembly.
Right.
And I did get arrested, and it was a citation. It was a very minor thing. It was funny because I was silently holding a tri-folded American flag, very solemnly. I wasn't making any noise. It was just the people around us. But because myself and the Reverend were the center of this thing, we were. Well, he was arrested. He at least he was speaking. I would hardly call his prayer loud and boisterous, but my citation was for unlawful assembly, loud and boisterous. Last time I checked, that's still allowed under the First Amendment to the Constitution.
So what do you think it's going to be like come later on this year or next year where there are more veterans protesting at places like that for officers that have to go ahead and do the arrests? Like, that's got to be a really weird feeling. Like, oh my God, we're going to have to arrest all these veterans. I mean, and I've read reports about Homeland Security and the MIAC report targeting Ron Paul supporters.
I can't blame them for being afraid. Well, because this is why we have Senator Schumer to thank for the Veterans Disarmament Act. We have lost more veterans to suicide in the global war on terror, or as a result of the global war on terror, than we have in combat during the global war on terror. And it is, facts are stubborn things, and they don't cease to exist because you ignore them. And the American people want to ignore the plight of the soldiers, and they want to ignore the plight of veterans. And, they want to give this lip service crap, here's a yellow magnet on my car, support the troops, and then, go back to sleep. And, in the course of this campaign here, I got to say, it's been a disappointment to me that we have 300,000 troops in harm's way right now, and most of America doesn't seem to care. I don't get a lot of questions. I talk about being a veteran. I talk about getting back to a constitutional foreign policy. That we, if we're going to go to war, you declare it. You let the best military in the world at blowing things up and killing people go do their job and come home, and you don't end up in these open-ended politicized conflicts where inevitably profiteering becomes a factor, and the troops suffer as a result, and they end up putting their lives at risk in what is clearly not anything that is making the American people safer. And that's something really every American should be concerned about. And for me, having done a lot of work when I came home helping other veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a metaphor, or at least one way of looking at PTSD. It says it has three causes. One is lack of confidence in your equipment, one is lack of confidence in your mission, and the other one is lack of confidence in your leadership. Well, in Iraq, we had all three. Mm-hmm. And the less, when you don't have confidence in your circumstance, when you are being asked to put your life on the line for your country, and you look at you're not being equipped. I had to sandbag my Humvee when I got to Iraq, even in 2004. When you don't have confidence in the mission, because there isn't a mission, there's no enemy that you can defeat and say, all right, we did that, now we can go home. There's no mission. We have this kind of mission creep that we see, and we look at the leadership. The military population is largely conservative, and George Bush was not a conservative, and the Republican Party, has to be honest about this. John McCain was not a conservative. They were progressives in the true Roosevelt sense. They were for bigger government and more federal control, and really didn't represent the truth the way that Ron Paul did as a constitutionalist. And of course now under Obama, I mean, there's got to be some serious cognitive dissonance that the soldiers, especially in harm's way, are dealing with. Mm-hmm. And it's disgusting to see that we, as an American, at least people, but most specifically our government and our Department of Veterans Affairs, we can't take care of the troops coming home. And in the case of the VA, when you file for a disability with the VA, mm-hmm. it is a horrible, arduous process. Whereas when you file taxes for the IRS, you fill out a form for your refund. If you've been giving them money all year, hey, they say, all right, here you go. We're going to take your word for it. We're going to look over it, and we'll spot check by audit. Well, in the VA, it's the opposite. They go through they do everything they can in this process to deny vets their claims, and we need to turn that around so that when guys get out of the military, if they're disabled, they can fill out a form, they can start getting their disability checked, mm-hmm. And then we wouldn't have this problem with homeless veterans. And then have the VA, trust that that those guys are on their word that they're doing it, and spot check. And we'd actually save money with a system like this because you wouldn't be investing in all this bureaucracy that exists, mm-hmm. really just to deny those claims. And so that's something I really want to work on as a member of Congress. I mean, we treat taxpayers better than we treat our veterans. And what we see particularly in the disability process, you could go into the VA missing an arm and a leg, and if you're missing your combat action ribbon, your paperwork, they're going to tell you, oh, those must not be combat-related